Hi, I'm Richard Howe. Welcome to Civil War Lowell, a three-part series of virtual tours about the city of Lowell, Massachusetts in the American Civil War. This is episode 2, the Minutemen of 1861. The presidential election of 1860 ended with Abraham Lincoln, the Republican nominee, winning the presidency. He defeated three other candidates, two from the Democratic Party, Stephen Douglas representing the northern wing and John Breckinridge representing the southern wing, and John Bell, who represented a third party, the Constitutional Union Party. When Lincoln was elected, he won every state in the North except for New Jersey, and he didn't win a single electoral vote from the southern states. His election prompted here's the outcome of the election. He only won a plurality of the popular vote, 40%, but because there were three other candidates, they split the rest amongst themselves. He did win 180 electoral votes to the second place finisher, John Breckinridge, who won 72. Well, Lincoln's election prompted the state of South Carolina to secede from the Union. They were convinced that Lincoln would take office with a mandate to end slavery, and they did not want that to happen, and so they ceased being part of the United States. The South Carolina was followed in January of 1861 by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. It's important to note that in the 1860s, even though the presidential election was in November, the new president didn't take office until March. The president takes office in early January. Back then, there was a wait of several months with leaving the lame duck president in charge. And that lame duck was James Buchanan. He was a Southerner, he supported slavery, and he did very little to keep the Southern states in as part of the Union. He opposed secession, but he didn't take any active steps to either keep the states in or to punish them or compel them to rejoin the Union during the last several months of his presidency. Well, on March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in. And at some point later that day, I think somebody in the White House came to him and said, "What are we going to do about Fort Sumter?" Well, Fort Sumter was one of a series of fortifications built along the Atlantic coast to protect us from enemies coming across the ocean. They were constructed before and after the War of 1812. One of the more famous ones is Fort McHenry in Baltimore, where the Star-Spangled Banner was written during the War of 1812. And Fort Sumter was one of these forts. Now, of course, these were expensive to build and maintain, so Fort Sumter was not either fully completed or fully garrisoned at the end of 1860. Just to give you an idea of the geographic layout, you can see from this Google Maps screen print where Lowell is in comparison to Charleston, South Carolina, which is where Fort Sumter was located. And the city of Washington is in between the two. Well, this is a close-up of the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina, which is an excellent harbor. You can see the Atlantic Ocean in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Then there's a narrow entrance to the larger harbor. And Charleston itself is on a peninsula in the upper left-hand corner. That peninsula is formed by two rivers which flow from inland part of the state. To defend the harbor, two forts were constructed. Fort Moultrie, which was on the northern shoulder of the opening to the harbor, was a carryover from the Revolutionary War, and Fort Sumter was constructed on an island that was near the southern boundary of the opening to the harbor. Fort Moultrie was originally called Fort Sullivan. It was a famous Revolutionary War battle that occurred early in the war. The British had tried to capture South Carolina because it was a key port, but an American force under Colonel William Moultrie repelled the invaders, and their fort was made out of logs, but it was such a strategically important point that the log fort was eventually replaced by a brick one that was renamed Fort Moultrie in honor of the Revolutionary War commander. Now, here are some scenes of Fort Moultrie. Now, remember, it's on the land. It's on the mainland, or this very large island called Sullivan's Island. So it would be more susceptible to attack from the land side than from the seaside. And while this more recent picture shows the fort with fairly sheer walls of brick, in 1861, because of a lack of repair, the sand from the dunes had blown and drifted up to the walls. So it was said that people from the outside could just walk up the slope of the sand dune and step over the wall of the fort and inside it. Now, in the middle right of this photograph, you can see the kind of tan horizontal object. That's actually Fort Sumter. So you can see from Fort Moultrie to across to Fort Sumter. It's a fairly wide expanse of water, but they are clearly visible from each other. Here's another shot of the wall of Fort Moultrie. Now, the commander of the garrison that defended both Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter was Major Robert Anderson, who was a member of the artillery branch of the United States Army. He was a very well-respected and competent soldier, but he only had 85 soldiers under his command to defend both fortresses. Here's a picture of Major Anderson and the other officers of his command. His second command is a captain whose name might be familiar to you, and his name is Abner Doubleday. He went on to become a general in the Union Army during the Civil War, and he's said to have been involved in the founding of baseball as we know it. Well, during normal times, the garrison occupied Fort Moultrie and lived there. It was just easier to operate. They bought most of their supplies from Charleston merchants. They communicated. They were able to get to the telegraph office more easily. But because the fort was so vulnerable to attack, Major Anderson felt that it would be more, he could better defend the installation by moving his 85 men to Fort Sumter. Well, he knew, because South Carolina had already seceded by this point, that if he made known his plans to do that, that the South Carolina militia would intercede and prevent that from happening. So he waited till Christmas night. It was actually a stormy, snowy night, but he loaded his men and what supplies they could carry in small boats. And in the middle of the night, they rowed across the harbor mouth to Fort Sumter, and they occupied that installation. Here's a contemporary drawing of them coming ashore at the rocky island that Fort Sumter sits upon. Well, the South Carolinians were outraged at Major Anderson's action. They immediately forbade anyone from trading with the fort. And so Anderson immediately had a crisis on his hands, because he only had enough food to feed his garrison for about 3 months. So they stayed there and they went on half rations, but that was only going to last them until about the end of April. And he was able to send a person ashore to communicate with Washington. They weren't totally isolated. So the United States government knew of the plight of the soldiers at Fort Sumter. This is a contemporary photo of Fort Sumter, which had been leveled by the Union Army when it retook the fortress later in the war, and then it was converted to a gun emplacement in World War II. So when President Lincoln took office, he had this real dilemma. He didn't want to allow Fort Sumter to surrender, because that would be a sign of weakness of the federal government. But on the other hand, he didn't want to mount an expedition to relieve the fort, which he knew would precipitate a war. He didn't want to be the one to actually start a shooting war between the seceded states and the rest of the Union. So when he was struggling with this dilemma, a man named Gustavus Fox, who was a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, came to the White House. Fox had attended the United States Naval Academy. He was a former naval officer. He was now in civilian life. And he volunteered to lead a relief expedition to Sumter. Lincoln went along with it, and he gave Fox control of this ship, the Star of the West. He put a company of soldiers on it, but it was mostly just food and other supplies, no ammunition, no guns. And what Lincoln did was very shrewd at this time. In April, early April, April 6th, he sent a telegram to Governor Francis Pickens of South Carolina, and he told him about this relief expedition coming. And he assured the governor that there would be no weapons, no reinforcements. It was merely a humanitarian mission to provide supplies so the fort's garrison would not starve. Now, this created a real problem for Governor Pickens, because South Carolina now considered itself to be an independent state. And the federal garrison on Fort Sumter constituted a foreign army in its midst, and it wanted that army gone. And it hoped to starve the soldiers at Fort Sumter into submission. So the last thing Pickens was going to do was to allow those soldiers to be resupplied. But what Lincoln was trying to do was to use the Gus Fox's relief mission as to precipitate the South from acting first. And that strategy worked. Fox set sail on April 9th from New York City on the Star of the West. He didn't know that Lincoln had tipped off the South Carolinians that he was coming, so he thought his arrival would be a surprise, that he'd be able to slip into the harbor at night, pull up to the fort, unload, and get out of there before anybody knew what happened. But South Carolina was expecting him, and as soon as Fox and his ship arrived off the coast of Charleston, there was stormy weather, so they couldn't come into the harbor. The artillery batteries of the South Carolina militia opened fire on Fort Sumter on Friday, April 12th at 4:30 in the morning. For the next 36 hours, the bombardment continued. Many of the wooden structures in Sumter burned, creating a blazing inferno. But none of the soldiers within the fort were killed by this hostile fire. Anderson did fire back some rounds, but he was short of both ammunition and shells. And so the fort paced themselves. They, of course, had no hope of succeeding. And so on the evening of Saturday, April 13th, Anderson finally surrendered the fort. The next day, Sunday, Lincoln met with his cabinet, and immediately after that meeting, he sent out a call to all of the states for 75,000 volunteer soldiers to help suppress the rebellion. Well, one of the states that responded positively to that request was Massachusetts. Lincoln was not the only new official elected in November of 1860. Massachusetts elected a new governor. His name was John Andrew. He was a Republican. He was also a strong abolitionist. Well, Massachusetts governor took office in January. Didn't have to wait till March. So Andrew had already been in office for a while. And Andrew knew from his contacts, his Republican contacts in Washington, that there was likely to be a war. So he came to office with a strong belief that he should convert the Massachusetts militia onto a wartime footing. He was joined in that belief by Ben Butler, who was actually a very strong political opponent of Andrew. Butler was a Democrat. In fact, Butler had attended the 1860 Democratic Convention, and he had voted for Jefferson Davis for the nominee for president. Davis, of course, went on to become the president of the Confederacy. Butler was no supporter of the Confederacy. He wanted to try to keep the Union intact. But as soon as these states seceded, Butler became convinced, too, that there would be a war. Butler was an officer in the militia, and he agreed that the units in Massachusetts should intensify their training and replace their old fancy uniforms with ones that were more serviceable if they were to go to the field and go to war. Governor Andrew issued General Order Number 4. In that he commanded all militia commanders to query their men to find out whether, because of age, physical infirmity, business or family commitments, that they would be unable to leave at a moment's notice if the call came. So many of the longtime soldiers in the militia who had really treated the military units as a social club were discharged, and their places were filled with younger, more aggressive men who would welcome the call to go to war. At the same time, the Massachusetts legislature appropriated a large amount of money for new rifles and new equipment, blankets, backpacks, overcoats, things like that for the local militia. Well, Massachusetts was primed for war in January, but nothing happened in that month, nothing happened in February, and nothing really happened in March. People were starting to doubt whether they should have gone to all this trouble when Fort Sumter was attacked. And when Fort Sumter was attacked, one of the first units to mobilize was the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, which was headquartered in Lowell. It had 8 companies of infantry. Now, back then, a company consisted of about 100 men. And the 6th had 4 companies based in Lowell, companies A, C, D, and H, 2 from Lawrence, 1 from Acton, and 1 from Groton. When the call came out from Washington to send regiments to Washington to put down the rebellion, the request specified companies of regiments of 10 companies. And so before the men from Lowell left Massachusetts, actually 3 other companies, ones from Worcester, Boston, and Stoneham, were added to their ranks. April 16th, 1861, the regiment formed up in this building, Huntington Hall, which was a combination train station public meeting hall. It was at the corner of Dutton Street and Merrimack Street in Lowell. They moved out. They took the train to Boston. That evening, they were slept at Faneuil Hall. The next day, April 17th, they marched to the Boston Common, where Governor Andrew addressed them from the State House. He gave them a new battle flag, and that's where they were issued their new rifles. They went to the Boston train station that serviced the Worcester line, and they departed. They went through Worcester, Hartford, Connecticut, and they arrived in New York City the next morning, April 18th. The entire regiment was treated to breakfast at the Metropolitan Hotel, one of the most elaborate hotels in New York City. They left the city, were ferried across to the Hudson River to New Jersey, where their train continued through Trenton to Philadelphia, where they arrived exhausted late in the afternoon and early in the evening on April 18th. The men were able to bivouac, go to sleep in a public building, and the officers all gathered at the Continental Hotel, which was one of the big hotels in Philadelphia that evening. In attendance that evening were executives from the railroad line that connected Philadelphia to Boston. They told Major Edward Jones, Colonel Edward Jones, the commander of the 6th Regiment, that they had heard that pro-Southerners in Baltimore were going to try to prevent any troops from the North from passing through Baltimore to get to Washington. With that knowledge, Colonel Jones jettisoned his plan to leave the next morning. He roused his troops at about midnight on April 18th, and in the early morning hours of April 19th, they set out by train from Philadelphia, bound for Baltimore. And there's a picture of the Continental Hotel where they gathered. Here's a picture of Colonel Jones. Now, and the route south from Philadelphia to Baltimore, you have to cross the large and wide Susquehanna River. In 1861, there was no railroad bridge across it. Instead, the cars were ferried across a couple at a time. Now, Jones's plan was that when they reached Baltimore in the early morning hours, the entire regiment would fall out, would form up in formation, and 1,000 men would march through the city and to the other station, the Camden station, from which they had to depart to get to Washington. Jones felt that 1,000 armed men would intimidate any protesters who might otherwise try to cause them harm. But the plan went awry early in the morning while everyone was asleep, when the train was reassembled on the south side of the Susquehanna River. Jones's car was put in the middle of the train, not at the lead, and he, like everyone else, was asleep from exhaustion, so he never realized that they had pulled into Baltimore, not at 6 o'clock in the morning before anybody got up, but at 10 o'clock in the morning when the waterfront was starting to arise. Now, this is President Street Station. This is where trains from the north would arrive. And Baltimore has two train stations, President Street and Camden Station. And they're a little bit like the train stations in Boston, North and South Station. Now, if you were going from Lowell, Massachusetts to New York City by train, you would take a train from Lowell to North Station, and then you would take another train from South Station to New York. Well, how do you get from North Station to South Station? There are many ways. You can walk, you can take a cab, you can take a subway. The only way you can't go is by train because they're not connected together. Well, that's what it's like in Baltimore. And here's the Camden Station, the ultimate destination of the 6th Regiment, so that they could continue on their journey. So here's a little sketch. You see that the President Street Station is to the east on one side of the inner water basin of Baltimore Harbor, and Camden Station is on the west. Well, what typically happened was the cars of the trains arriving at President Station would be decoupled, and one by one they would be dragged on the streetcar tracks by horse teams along Pratt Street all the way to Camden Station, which was a distance just over a mile. And that's what happened to the first couple of cars of the 6th Massachusetts train. And it was only when half of the cars were already underway across the city that Colonel Jones woke up and realized what was going on. He decided to just hope for the best, and he allowed his car to be drawn through the city. However, the next car, which contained Major Benjamin Watson, who was the second in command of the regiment, and another company of infantry, was stopped mid-passage, and their car was derailed by an obstacle that had been placed on the track. Watson got out of the car, which was being pelted by rocks and sticks. He pulled out his revolver. He flagged down another horse team that was passing by, forced the driver to help get that car back on the track, and then to pull that car all the way to Camden Station. So Watson and the men with him reached there safely. That wasn't the case for the next 4 companies, the last 4. Their way was completely blocked, and their senior captain, Albert Folensby of Lowell, ordered the 4 companies of men to dismount from the rail cars and then to march through the city. As they marched, the mob started attacking the men, hitting them with bricks, sticks, yelling at them. One Massachusetts soldier was hit in the head with a brick. As he fell to the ground unconscious, a member of the mob stepped forward, picked up the soldier's rifle, turned it on the ranks of the troops, and fired. That caused the soldiers to turn, level their own rifles, and fire a volley into the crowd. A running gun battle ensued for the next few minutes. By the time it was over, 4 of the soldiers were dead, 36 were wounded, and 12 of the civilians had died from return fire from the soldiers. Here are a couple of contemporary views by artists of the fight that took place. Well, eventually the soldiers made it to Camden Station. They brought some of their wounded with them, others they had to leave behind. They boarded a train at Camden Station that took them to Washington. They were met there by President Lincoln. There were no loyal troops in Washington at this time, and just across the Potomac River was Virginia, which was on the verge of seceding from the Union. And Lincoln was very fearful that Confederate forces would swoop into Washington and seize the capital in a lightning strike before any loyal troops had arrived. So he was delighted to see the men from the 6th. They were billeted in the Capitol, which was still under construction at that time. And they remained in that area, Washington and Maryland, for the rest of their 90-day enlistment. Now, of the 4 soldiers killed, 2 were young mill workers from Lowell, Luther Ladd, Addison Whitney. Also killed was Sumner Needham of Lawrence. And the final man killed was a guy named Charles Taylor, who no one knows much about. He had only joined the regiment in Boston as it was about to depart on this journey. He didn't have a uniform. He had been issued a weapon, though. And so the thinking is that when he fell in the street, because he didn't have any close friends in the unit because he was so new, and also because he wasn't in a uniform, people took him for a civilian. Nobody claimed the body, and it was buried in an unmarked grave, and that grave has never been discovered. So Taylor's body has never been found. This is a plaque that's on the Ladd and Whitney Monument in Lowell. It's dedicated to Taylor, but again, his remains are still missing. Well, back in Lowell, the bodies of Luther Ladd and Addison Whitney were transported back to the city. There, one of the largest gatherings ever held in the city's history was held, a memorial service at Huntington Hall. The 2 young soldiers were buried elsewhere, but towards the end of the war, in April 1865, the city and the state of Massachusetts joined together to create this monument, which was named for Ladd and Whitney. It was actually dedicated in June of 1865, and it now sits right in front of Lowell City Hall. Now, everyone at the time was very much aware that April 19th, 1861, the day of the Baltimore riot, was also the anniversary of the opening battles at Lexington and Concord that started the American Revolution in 1775. And that sentiment gave great prominence to the engagement of the 6th Massachusetts Infantry in Baltimore and the deaths of Ladd and Whitney and Needham and Taylor. This image is a mural that sits in the Massachusetts State House in a very prominent place. Now, the inscription below it says, "Marching through Baltimore in 1861 on the historic 19th of April, true to the tradition of their own Lexington and Concord, defending the Constitution and the Union, and carrying freedom to all who shall live beneath the stars and stripes." And that's the story of the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry and the coming of the American Civil War, the Minutemen of 1861. And that's episode 2 of my Civil War Lowell series. Please be sure to check out episode 1, which is the Lords of the Loom, about the coming of the Civil War and the struggle between cotton and abolitionism. And in the future, look for episode 3, which talks about Ben Butler and how he saved the Union in the 2 months after the start of the Civil War. I'm Richard Howe. Thank you for joining me. Have a nice day.